Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. Just wanted to remind folks, of course, that there's a rather large archive of Expanding Mind shows. A lot of them are on my website, techgnosis.com, along with posts, little chunks of text, a huge archive of writings, information about upcoming events, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that as well. I'm starting to put together events for high weirdness, as well as the ongoing psychedelic sangha experience. So the next psychedelic sangha event for those of us, or those of you who are in San Francisco, is coming up on April 13th, a Saturday, and I might be doing an event down in Los Angeles with our guest today, Spiros Antonopoulos, who we will meet in just a moment, sometime maybe later in April. Also, at the end of the month on the East Coast, I'm going to be participating in two iterations of the same event, Profane Illuminations. This is an event centered on Strange Attractor, which is one of the publishers of High Weirdness, run by the wonderful, remarkable, mercurial Mark Pilkington, an old friend of mine. I've known him almost 20 years now. And he's put together just an amazing press. They publish wonderful books in what he likes to call unpopular culture or strange culture. It's a perfect place for high weirdness, and we're going to be doing an event at NYU in New York City, of course, on April 27th, Saturday, and 2 days later on the Monday up in Cambridge. There'll be an MIT Press event, one of the other publisher of the book, and we'll be doing more stuff up there. Some other guests who've been on the show are gonna be around, Peter Berbegal and other folks. It's really going to be a great time. So if you're out there, there will be more specific information very shortly on my events tab in techgnosis.com. I'll get to that in the next couple of days. You know, I move slowly. I'm kind of a tortoise, slow and steady wins the race style, and so the Patreon's not ready yet. Probably won't be ready next week. Maybe probably won't even be ready the week after that, but we're getting there. We're moving forward. So be prepared for more calls for attention coming my way. At this point, all I'm going to ask you to do is, if you haven't taken the opportunity to leave a review of Expanding Mind wherever you get your podcasts, please consider doing so. It really does seem to make a difference. And I want the numbers. I want more numbers, man. The number greedy guys out in force. I don't really know actually how much numbers really make a difference, because you talk to 5 awesome, brilliant, creative people, or you can talk to 500 whatevers. I don't want to insult people randomly, but it's really hard to know the meaning of these numbers, how people actually listen to things. They just download them, whatever. But it's always nice to get numerical support. Well, enough of the intro part. Today, I'm really happy to have my old dear friend Spiros, or Spiro, on the show. We've known each other for quite a long time. I think, wow, I don't know, 30 years, 25 years, something like that. And he's been on the show before. The last time he was on, we were talking about his interesting brain event that occurred to him a number of years ago, when we weren't really sure what Spiro was going to come back from this sort of stroke slash, wasn't an aneurysm, it was like a brain event. So let's just call it a brain event, which was a fascinating conversation. I think you can still dig it out, if not on my website. I think Podbean has a longer archive of my shows. But today we're going to be talking about yoga, because among other things, Spiro is an awesome and quite devoted Ashtanga yogi, and he's been on the yoga path for quite a long time. And so I thought it'd be good to kind of get in again one of these themes that I like to come back to, which is, the sort of countercultural context of a lot of practices that have since become more mainstream, and really thinking about what kind of what's the spirit involved in how we practice and why we practice. And this is particularly key for Spiro, who's moved into a teacher role. He's set up a studio with his partner in Los Angeles called the Los Angeles Yoga Club, and they've been cranking out the Ashtanga over there. And so we're going to talk about yoga today, but first let's talk about Spiro, where we came from. So Spiro, thanks for joining me on Expanding Mind.
Hi, Eric. Thank you.
It's my old friend. I think I told the story the last time, but we met online. This is back in the day, kids. I know some probably when you're younger and you're like, oh man, here they go again. But hey, this is our life. So what are you going to do?
Right. It was back in the day when Boing Boing was a magazine.
Yes, back. And then we met on the internet before the World Wide Web, which just seems like one of those important bifurcation points, on the Fringeware Review listserv. And Fringeware Review was also a magazine, kind of like Boing Boing. What was the difference between them? What do you think?
Just two different people. It was back in the zine culture. So, basically it was neuro psychedelic. The idea of the internet and of electronic computer world had potential and possibilities, and I think there were both people that used that.
Oh yeah, and it had that sense of it was kind of like a kind of a midway build between the maturing zine culture of the 80s and the exploding kind of bulletin board, then onto alt groups, internet, listservs and such. And it was a really great place to meet. It was fun because we knew each other for a while, just purely virtually, until we met and started hanging out. But when I knew you back then, you were like super freak. And when I first met you had all these like bones in your nose, and it was just full on. And you were living in Taos, New Mexico. And for folks who don't know, Taos is north of Santa Fe, which is a beautiful area. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the United States, and one of the most mystical in my experience. I mean, there's something really magical and even spooky about that place. And it was in this sort of, at that time, deeply counterculture environment that you first got into yoga, but in a kind of interesting route. So what were you up to at that time that led you into the yoga zone?
At that point, I had come into contact with some people that had left New York City, a teacher in the Crowley world, a thelemic teacher whose his teacher was Grady McMurtry. And I don't know exactly why he and his partner left, but they left for Taos and started an organization, the Initiates of the Flame, and I became involved. And basically what they had me do, what we were doing is meditating every day and taking notes. So every day I had to, amongst other things, either chant, do breathing exercises, or just sit.
Yeah.
And that began the journey. And actually, I didn't even realize it when I got to New York many moons later that I thought I had just left my Crowley occult world behind. But as I return nowadays, looking back, all of Crowley's literature is filled with basic Ashtanga yoga, basic Patanjali and Shiva Samhita.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That if you do your esoteric history, you become aware of it, but it really has not leaked out beyond that zone for the most part. Is just how it's not even that so much that Crowley was just that he was instrumental in bringing yogic practice and meditation practice, both from a kind of Patanjali orientation as well as Theravadan Buddhist meditation practices and cosmologies. It wasn't just that he helped bring them to the West, which he did. It's that if you go back now and you read his writings, then you see two things. One is that he actually either like grokked something really well in a way that still speaks to us now, or that the way that we still speak and approach these things is so very similar to his approach, but it's fresh. So a lot of writings from those years about practice and Buddhism and the Dharma and Tantra are kind of dry, from Westerners, are kind of dry. They're a little like, what am I supposed to do with this? You're not really sure how good the scholarship is. You'd rather read a modern scholar. It's not really clear what they're doing. But Crowley really wrote as a practitioner, and he clearly had very deep experiences that also really enlivened his crazy magic. And if a lot of his like Western magic stuff, or his Thelema and the OTO and all the rituals, whatever, it's kind of over the top. I think most of us, even people who are into magic, are like, whoa, that's a bit, that's a triple layer fudge cake of occult, ritual and imagination. But running through the whole thing is this current of something that's in a way kind of more basic and just barreling along, which is the sense that there's his whole practice was kind of enlivened by his yogic experiences.
Watch the mind, follow the breath, return to the breath.
Importance of posture, the way of looking at like what's the connection between a magical hand gesture or a drawing a pentagram in the air and a mudra, or even a physical posture, like that kind of connection was really rich and really ripe. So I always encourage people to take a look at Crowley's texts on yoga in particular, because they add a sort of fire to what is often a little bland in terms of how Western yoga and Western meditation is presented, particularly these days.
Book 4. I'm just returning to it. Book 4 is amazing in its clarity of focus. In if you want to understand Patanjali Ashtanga Yoga, he covers Ashtanga Yoga quite clearly. I mean, he also goes back to it years later in lectures. But this, he's basically saying, focusing the mind and basically the sense organs. Where are the sense organs going? Who's watching? He's asking these questions and he's applying them gesturally, but a gesture is asana.
The gesture is asana. Now, when you first started to practice Ashtanga, what was it about? You came, you had this desire, you wanted to practice more yoga. What was it about Ashtanga in particular at a time when there's many different postural yoga systems, different names, different lineages? What did you just stumble into it, or what called you about that?
The main thing was that there wasn't an instructor in front that was performing, not just performing, but also putting weird ideas in my head. I felt vulnerable when I would go to yoga classes in the 90s, and I felt there wasn't that much intellectual rigor when I was sensitive, and in my head at that time, I just felt like I actually appreciated the silence. But it's also about self-practice, and that's something that people involved with Thelema and any occult traditions, or most meditational traditions, will know that you basically practice alone, that there's something that's it's just about your practice. So all those things led me to Ashtanga Yoga Mysore rooms, where while you're with other people, there's nobody telling you exactly what to do. You're not all following on the same beat.
Yeah, so then you work at your own pace through a set series of postures. I practiced some Ashtanga when I was first starting out doing yoga regularly, but I couldn't quite back it.
No.
It's definitely it calls for certain people, because it's not just about the self practice, which I was really attracted to, but there's also, it seems like it calls forth, or I would even say not demands, but really it thrives in response to your own disciplined devotion, and particularly a kind of daily or near daily commitment to that
daily,
same
near
practice.
daily.
Yeah.
Yep, daily and near daily, but also a sort of people that are really into that sort of daily habit, and that their bodies can adapt to it quickly. I mean, nowadays, I think, or just with age and with a long time set at a practice, we ease up, I think, on what we expect a pose to look like or a body to do. But early on, and even in the 90s, people were more rigorous on pushing ourselves.
Oh,
and I
yeah.
think nowadays, I think we're more just happy to be doing something, to be using the body, and realize that all bodies are totally different.
Yeah, it's
some
true.
way.
I think that, I mean, that's noticeable even practicing outside of the context of Ashtanga. I remember the first yoga classes I went to at Jivamukti in New York City in the 90s, the mid 90s. They were scary. Like, it was probably because I was young and insecure, and, you know, like, you're so self-conscious and whatever. And, you know, that lasted for years doing yoga practice. But I mean, I would like went in there like kind of quaking, like, you know, not just because the poses might be challenging. And I remember some really challenging poses for me anyway. But just the whole energy was like, we're not screwing around. This isn't to make you feel better necessarily. I mean, it's like a practice, and we're going to push it, and we're going to see where we go, and we'll support you, but it's not, you know, there's no sense of kind of coddling. There wasn't any kind of, you know, fuzzy blanket around the thing. And even later on, when I started practicing locally with the studio that had a lot of different kinds of teachers who were doing, you know, whatever, vinyasa, power yoga, things that were influenced by Ashtanga, but other things, and a little bit of you know, other, just like a mix of practices. There was still more of this kind of intensity and a sort of pushing, like, we're all here together and we're pushing. And you would just get in an ordinary class more difficult poses that, and I go to the same studio. So it's kind of like watching it change over the years isn't just about this studio. It's about the whole world of yoga. And it has gotten less intense, and it has gotten, I think, a little bit less pushing forward, and for some good reasons. People get hurt, different kind of people coming, older people come, you know, whatever. Like, I don't need to do that stuff that much. It's okay that I haven't achieved some of these really wild poses that at some point I thought I was getting close to, or some of them I did achieve and now I can't do anymore. Like you say, you get older, it doesn't really matter as much. But there's also something about the vibe. There's something about the yoga vibe, even back then, had, you know, it was still just, again, you know, it's not the right word to say, oh, it was just more countercultural. It was just, it had, I don't know, it had a liveliness that's different than now.
I mean, the Mysore rooms, especially, even still to some degree, but we can talk about the differences. But then, especially, it was during our time of the web was still just getting going. Information was still word of mouth. You still heard about things, or you saw a piece in a newspaper or magazine, and you snuffed it out. You found the place, and then, you know, in New York, whether it was Jivamukti in the 90s or actually even Eddie, they're both, I mean, it's all these rooms where you'd find that weren't super well labeled. You'd go in and it would be dark, and there's a whole room full of people just sweating, and it smells weird, and it's crowded, and there's something strange and kind of magical about it. Like, you would start to go, and you would be there every day, and there's tons of people you recognize. You think, oh gosh, is that someone I recognize from the movies or something? Or is that, you know, it's hard to tell, and you don't know anybody's name, and everybody's sort of struggling and grunting, and there's something kind of crazy about that over time. You feel an intimacy with people that you don't even know, really, or you kind of know, some quality of them that other people don't even know their name.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting feeling, that kind of bonding you get with people when you're mutually going through difficulty, even without communicating about it, or even without eye contact, there's still kind of a sense of that. And, obviously that can happen in any kind of class where people are pushing themselves, and, CrossFit or whatever you get. That's part of what I think gets people enthusiastic about it. But what was interesting, I think, in those times is that even though it wasn't exactly clear what was quote unquote spiritual about this, it was asking more. I mean, it had if you will, a psychedelic tinge. There was something strange about it, or unknown. There was still an element of kind of of mystery to it. But you mentioned Eddie, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about how interesting that particular teacher was, Eddie Stern, and the New York yoga club that he ran, and his whatever he's morphed into, kind of yoga celebrity teacher, writer figure, friend of Deepak Chopra. But again, like the scene he had at the time was kind of punk rock, and what how did you stumble into him?
He was very punk rock. I was practicing when I first got to New York, which was 2001. And it was before the towers fell. And I started at, I had no money. I went to Jivamukti because they took a credit card and I could chalk up my credit card. And I soon just felt like I needed something else for various reasons. I grew... I just didn't like the Jivamukti vibe at that time. So I started looking around, and I heard about Eddie's, but there was no sign on the door. It took me days of walking past the door that was his place on Broome and Crosby. It took me days to walk up the stairs and actually go in and talk to somebody. And the punk rock aspect was very much, he was a punk rock kid in New York. And he started going to India, in his teens at that time. And David and Sharon took him up under their wings. They were a little bit older, and going to India and trying to learn something about yoga and find teachers. And a whole thing unfolded from there. But
what was the element of... How would you characterize the element of the spiritual, the sacred? Since you were already open to that vibe, you were interested in these esoteric paths, you were interested in magic and in ritual and practice and psychedelic experience as another vehicle or dimension of the search, and stumbling into this practice again. It's always interesting how yoga both is and is not sacred in the West. It's both right. a material, calisthenic, health and good butt oriented form of consumerism, and at the same time, and in all sorts of different mixtures, this sort of transmutation of an Eastern practice with its own sort of occult elements, actually, that come in at various points with the chakra system and other kinds of esoteric ideas. And it's really this amazing mix. And how was that mix presented, or not even so much presented, but how did you open up to that mix in the context of studying with Eddie?
Well, it happened in Taos. I had a friend, Sonia, who was teaching Ashtanga yoga sometimes. And I got a piece of paper that had all the poses on it. And I started doing it basically when I had a broken heart. I had broken up with somebody and I was kind of going kooky, and I needed something that sort of stabilized me. And I just made a commitment. Everything was down and out. And I had to make a commitment that I would, regardless of what I would do the rest of the day, I would go through this whole sequence, and, I would be dedicated to this yoga mat, which became my sort of prayer rug. And regardless of what else I would do anywhere else, I would just stick with it. And that was my daily practice. And it took me 2 hours when I first started to do all the primary series. And that's not the proper way of learning. But it was what I did. I just started practicing every day. And it was a time when I couldn't make a phone call. I couldn't do anything else. I had to actually focus. And I learned that I actually had a wily mind that would teach me how to, I would cut corners. I would do all these things. And eventually it helped me rinse a lot of that out and actually do things more and more rhythmically. By the book, kind of, but more just within the rhythm of the context without actually cutting corners for me or what I thought of was me, but it was me being lazy. So I learned these qualities about myself within the context of a yoga mat. It was a little bit like staring at a wall, but in this case, it had a rhythm, and that rhythm was important when you breathe, when you step this way or that way. And I learn a lot about myself and see what I project. And I realized that what I was projecting into the world at large was also what I was projecting in my yoga. And actually that was a huge revelation.
Well, it also brings up something that you and I talk about a lot, which is just the quality of practice. And the term, it means a lot of different things. And we usually think about practice when you're practicing something, like you're practicing piano or you're practicing yoga or you're practicing to do language or whatever. But there's something about practice as itself, and particularly in the sense of repetition isn't quite the right word, but a kind of ritual devotion to it, and definitely going through all of the tricks that you say that the mind erects to not do the thing, because we're very resistant in a lot of ways. And even if the thing you're practicing maybe has nothing to do with spirituality, it's not really about spiritual or not spiritual. It's that there's some kind of energy that practice brings into whatever dimension of life you're directing it towards, that charges it. And when that practice does have a spiritual dimension, or at least a psychological dimension, where you're intimately with yourself, or you're stretching, you're opening up energies in your body, you're opening up feelings you haven't had before. It's incredibly powerful. I mean, I've never been quite as rigorous about it as you have. And, here's actually kind of something interesting. When you describe yourself in Taos, particularly before you even had like a real teacher, it's not like you were going into a yoga studio every day to do this practice. There was some part of you that knew that was going to be a lifeline, that rigorous rhythm was going to be a lifeline at a point where your life was very scattered. I mean, you were all over the place. You were had wild experiences and crazy people and moving around. And, you were very much a kind of fringe freak character in terms of your lifestyle. And
in terms of like the, psychedelics, I had no idea that ayahuasca would be like a huge thing in culture years later.
That's right. You were doing, that's another whole story we could have, is you were one of the lab rats in Rick Strassman's DMT experiments. So you were getting intravenous DMT, and you were doing that because you were already familiar with ayahuasca at a point when very few people were exploring those realms, in the United States, for sure. And even there wasn't a kind of tourism industry, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was really a different time. But where do you think that instinct about the rhythm of practice came from in your life? Because
it came, I basically opened up to it out of desperation, out of just, not really having another choice, because I was so destabilized. I was, I mostly, in order to be in my body, I thought that maybe just having sex all the time would be great, but that was unreliable at best, or just a fantasy, or both. But I just felt suddenly this was something that I could do, and it embodied and was a commitment to myself, which was a big deal, actually, for me in my life. Actually, thinking about it now helps me remember that it was not a simple task to be a psychedelic person in the 90s, in a sense, and try to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? How do I make money? Websites. So those type of things became more stabilized with a daily practice.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like such an important key, when people are seeking and they're trying to find what's the best practice, what's the thing to do, who's the teachers or teaching, what's the method, and da da da. And really, a lot of it is just in your own hands in terms of your attitude towards practice. And I feel compelled to, as someone who was a close observer of Ashtanga and who submitted myself at a couple of different points to the sequence. And at some point I always got injured. And so I just decided in the end that the Ashtanga was not for me. I'm sure it was not Ashtanga's fault. But I spent a lot of time around people who were doing this. And while there were people who I really admired their devotion, it was also really clear that there was like a significant percentage of the Ashtanga people were like type A overachievers, because it really fed a certain kind of like, every day, like these, you could see these like guys who would like do it every morning, and then they would go to work and like, whatever, do cutthroat, work or whatever. I mean, there was this kind of intensity about it, which has always been interesting with you, because you don't have that quality, that you're not a type A person like that. You're not an overachiever. You're not proving anything to daddy, at all. You never have. In fact, the opposite. And yet you found a way through the rich, not even ritual's not even the right word, just the repetition, the devotion, the commitment to that practice has been this through line through your life since then, and such a positive one.
No, it was a calling. It was definitely something I felt comfortable with on some weird level. And it brings me back to New York with Eddie's, because Eddie's had a lot of those people, a lot of people that were really high up in various corporations and all this stuff. And it allowed me to have a window into other worlds and other people. A lot of people who I would have never met. And on the yoga floor, we're all sort of equals. I mean, there's people that are this or that, but in the end, we're all finding our limits and we're all working with it. We're all breathing. We're all sweating. We're all dealing with what are the rest of the life outside effects, and we come to a yoga mat and we do our best. And so suddenly in New York City, I met tons of people that I would have never met anywhere else, and it took a time of actually seeing a humanity across the whole thing, whereas before I may have judged or framed people as this type of person or that type of person. Part of that was due to being a chaiwala at that time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, you had a very specific role in that place that always intrigued me, like that you managed to move to New York broke and basically craft the life of a monk. You lived this like a monk, like you were a chaiwala monk yogi in New York City, at this precious time in the transformation of the city.
I would ride my bicycle it was also a temple. I must say that Pattabhi Jois was in town in 2001 when the towers fell. And that's when I decided to teach, or to serve tea, was basically when the towers fell and everybody was in town. I was like, who's making the chai for a gathering that Eddie put together? And he's like, you make chai? And I said, yeah, I make chai. And I hadn't made chai before. But then he asked, then I made 10 gallons with an old friend who has made chai. And Eddie was like, why don't you make this every day at my place? And I was like, sure. So that began a daily practice of riding my bicycle to Eddie's and to the Ganesha temple at like 3 a.m. It would still be the night before for most of the people that were out at bars, making out on the streets. And for me, it was the next day. I was going to put the water on and practice yoga before people got there at 6.
Yeah, and you had a great chai too, man. I mean, it's really tasty stuff. But what I loved about that whole role you had is that you provided something. I mean, Eddie's was an unusual space in a number of ways. One is that it really was a temple, like a real temple, where there's like a murti, a statue that needs devotion. And if you're going to have a murti around you, it's like another one of those commitment things. You got to, treat it well every day. So
Every day.
there's a liveliness to that place. And even though you could go there and not really be that aware of it, I mean, you'd see the temple of, the statue of Ganesha or the murti of Ganesha or whatever. But you wouldn't, it's like maybe it's decor. Who knows? Like a lot of yoga studios, they just have it as decor. But it wasn't. It was actually alive. But it was so always interesting the way that Eddie both presented that, but was also kind of down, it was sort of low key in a way about that aspect. It was more everyday religion rather than like, oh my God, this is this great temple and holy place where you go and you can practice. That's always the impression that I had. And then you, providing the chai, it was like it created that little social nub of the conversational quality that can grow up, particularly around tea. I mean, it can happen around coffee too, but in my opinion, tea produces a slightly different, slightly mellower kind of interaction, although also enthusiastic. And it kind of filled in something that's just missing from a lot of yoga, which is that you feel these connections with people in the room. There's a sense of doing something together, or being alone together in this powerful way, and that there's a kind of transformative energy that's opened up. But the kind of generic, like after the class, people sort of chatting, and it's just, it's just like, it's not that interesting. So a lot of people just bail. And so you kind of like, it's almost like a wasted opportunity. And there you were able to kind of hold space for a lot of people who were pretty serious practitioners. And it made an amazing weave.
It's true. I mean, the other thing was that it was also it was called the Sri Ganesha Tea and Book Stall, and so a lot of the source texts that influenced Eddie and he would sell at the tea stall, at the book stall, and I would actually read them after I get the chai going. There'd be like a window of a half hour, 45 minutes of actually just reading root texts from the Bhagavad Gita to the Granda Samhita to the Shiva Samhita, all the Yoga Sutras and various versions and commentaries. And that actually helped me to postulate and integrate other Indian ideas to the best of my abilities, and also allow a topic of conversation for the day. When people came in and I had a big bell, and if it just got too cacophonous, I would just ring the bell and everybody would quiet down. It was pretty funny, but it was also performance art. I was at a bar, I was basically a bartender, and people sometimes would use the chai shop at the end after practice as a sort of motivation for getting people into practice. And it was a gathering place where people actually got to learn each other's names and what people do, or at least, what they look like in clothes. Yeah.
So, I want to kind of move forward to the now, looking at the clock. And I think it's important to say, you spent a lot of time in Mysore in India, and, you did the whole thing. You got your certification. You're like a bona fide Ashtanga teacher. But the whole world is, changed. Yoga's changed. Ashtanga's changed. Pattabhi Jois, died years ago, and his son took over, and the character of the organization has changed. But again, everything is kind of a bit different. And one of the things that I think sort of interesting about your story right now, as you've gone into like choosing to be a teacher and starting a studio and facing the challenges of, being a business person in Los Angeles and, in this kind of different environment that we're in, is that you come in with like all this good stuff. I mean, you got the goods, you got that juice in your your soul, man. You got that earthiness, and it's just the kind of teacher I would want if I was like looking for like a serious, yoga commitment. And yet that's your story, and, you're over here, and then there's like the world of like making a business work. And how does that work? How does that happen now? What happens to to what's happened to yoga now and how you see things changing. So I just would love to hear a little bit about your, both your satisfactions and your challenges in terms of setting up a yoga studio these days that's still true to this spirit that we've been talking about, these underground roots, the esoteric, the mystical, the student, the studied, but also the really heartfelt and devotional.
Erica and I came back from India with ideas of opening a place in Los Angeles. And I had been going back and forth, spending 3 months, 6 months here and there in Los Angeles, but I hadn't really fully made a dent in the community besides a couple old friends. So it took a year of looking around for a place, and a lot's changed in Los Angeles, even in that time, in over 6 years at this point. It came from 6 years ago, it was still possible to find little pockets of places and little apartments or a little bit of a warehouse somewhere that doesn't cost a lot of money, that you don't need a business plan or an idea. It doesn't have to be the next big thing. It just is a space that you're renting. But that space, that idea sort of changed, or maybe just evaporated in the time that we were looking. So it took a long time to find a place in Los Angeles. And that was one thing. Sharath also is a different type of teacher than Pattabhi Jois. Lots of it is for the better, in that he's younger. He's a great teacher. I mean, when Pattabhi Jois was the main instructor, Sharath always was really sweet to me and very helpful. I got a lot more one-on-one, heartfelt interactions with Sharath because Pattabhi Jois was the big guy and he was running around and everybody wanted something from him, and Sharath was just helping out. So I really enjoyed that. And that always sits with me the whole time. But he also has a very much more systematic approach, whereas Pattabhi Jois was a lot more wily. He had a research institute, whereas Sharath's place is more devotion to his grandfather. And now it becomes more and more particular, whereas before it was a lot more loose. There was a lot more open to interpretation, at least from the perspective of a semi-psychedelic person from America.
Yeah.
And I think that was a lot of the people that actually popularized Ashtanga yoga.
Absolutely. I mean, but that also makes me think of another kind of question about as you communicate about the existence of your studio, in a way you have to create what we can only call a brand or certain vibe. You notice it in your mailings, in the decor, and in the logo. That's something that one does. But it also seems to me that we're at a point where there's just so much media, there's so much things grabbing people's attention, there's so much branding, there's so much marketing, there's so much density and intensity to that flow that it's also hard to have that quality of ambiguity, of mystery, of wiliness in your presentation of what you're doing. It's almost like in order to play that game, you have to get more like concrete and literal in order to knock people over the head saying, hey, this thing's here. But if it's too sort of, ambiguous and crepuscular and ambivalent and who knows what it is or whatever, it's like that's not going to work because that's not the world we're in. Exactly.
Both for looking for a place and also for teaching. I mean, in looking for a place, people, if you don't fit into a box, like you're like a coffee place that it's going to be on the corner with a hot restaurant, then the investors in the building can flip it in 7 years. People weren't that interested. They thought yoga and that leads me to the second thing is everyone has an idea of what yoga is now. So it's less mystique around it and more pragmatics. Everyone, oh yeah, I know what that is. And it involves going to a neighborhood yoga practice and having somebody give me a workout. And while that's totally true, and that's enough for a lot of people, that's not, that loses some of the mystique. And there's a lot more people involved in, there's a lot more yoga schools in general all across the world, all across the country. So there's partially because in order to keep a yoga school or yoga studio afloat, just having the people come in and pay something doesn't cover the rent. So suddenly people have to give teachers trainings. And so people rush teachers through at a very rapid pace in order to, quote unquote, deepen your practice, which is totally cool and totally fine. And there's a lot of great information. But it's a little bit different than what I went through with Eddie, for example, which was all my friends around me were teaching yoga, and we were at the same sort of level in yoga at the time in terms of where we were practicing in the sequences, as if that's exactly the same, but that's what was going on. And so other people were making money in doing that. And Eddie would always tell me, no, you just practice. Don't teach. And so it would be very frustrating. So there's this difference between how yoga is. Nowadays you start doing some yoga, you like it, you do a teacher training, and you're a teacher. And so that's changed the whole the landscape, both from what a teacher is and what the teachers think yoga is or have to offer, and also the barrier of what the community thinks of as what yoga is. And part of being a yoga teacher in Los Angeles involves also people dealing with people's, all of us, we have ideas about the way the world is. And it's not until sometimes that is broken down and dissolved a bit or loosened, can we actually see different qualities in what we thought was true.
Well, I think you just put your finger on something really key about the whole way that a lot of practices and spiritual traditions are being transformed now, from psychedelics to meditation to yoga to the occult, even, like all of these things. I think Christian mysticism maybe has a different experience. That's maybe it's not across the board, but a lot of the things that we came from, and one of them is this kind of sense of a sort of literalism or a kind of knowingness, and in part that represents a pragmatism that you mentioned before, which in some ways is really positive. It's like show me the beef. It's like, great, I could have a lot of mystical vibes and feel like I'm kind of tuning into ancient secrets, but like how am I actually going to change? What are things that are really going to happen? So in a way, that pragmatism is healthy, but the pragmatism is also bound up with the whole commercialization, meaning not just the commercialization of the practices themselves and the books, and then the people starting their careers too young and being really pushy, and the whole entrepreneurial dimension and the kind of crassness of so much, but also the way in which it makes it easier for these practices to fit into a kind of standard, unquestioning, go get 'em, glossy, consumer capitalist ego, and it's something we've talked about on the show a lot, about how these things have become more and more bound up with the nature of capitalism, to the point where there's some people who just don't want to hear anything about it. Like, I don't want to hear about yoga. I don't want to hear about meditation. I don't want to hear about the Buddha. All of that stuff is a kind of palliative. This is a more radical position. It's not mine exactly, but I appreciate it. It's this kind of a palliative to get people to go back into the market and become even more aggressive and withstand the stresses and the pressures of our existence. And we've talked about this, a lot in our lives, in our private conversations. But I think it's actually a good thing to bring up, because it forces folks like us who are still really invested in these practices to be clearer about what they provide, what they can open up, how they can help change, dare I use the word transformation, in a way that isn't just about, getting yourself to not be so freaked out that you're able to just go live in the insane culture that we have. I mean, that's part of it. But for you, when you're thinking about what's really key for people, what do you think about?
Well, I mean, that's one of the great things about having a practice that's rote. I mean, Acom inhale, that's where it all starts. So we basically, if we get people to a mat doing that, that shows already a devotion to trying. But getting to that is actually some of the challenge. I mean, both in our place in downtown Los Angeles, but also, in a world where most of the people in Mysore get jobs via their Instagrams of them in fancy poses in front of an ancient temple, or so there's an idea both of what yoga is and what the knowledge transmitted should look like. So, I mean, I think the main thing is that I would say is that people talk to people, find out, you meet teachers, meet the people that you are going to interact with and practice with, and see if those people actually have something that you feel you want a little bit of, or you want a part of. It doesn't have to be something that they own per se, but it's an aura that's around them, that you want to be part of that community and you want to be part of a different vibe. Then that's what I would say is more important than a style, or whether it's mindful meditation or Ashtanga yoga. It's really about people and about a way of practicing or stabilizing some semblance of change.
Well, that issue of stabilization and relaxation, I mean, when we say relax, everybody thinks of like, okay, we know what stress is like, so let's de-stress. And there's a huge, or there's such a range of forms of relaxation, from whatever, the mild relaxation provided by a glass of beer to very concentrated, like cognitive behavioral therapy, like, oh, I'm having a stress out here, I'm going to do this process or this method here. But there are deeper qualities of relaxation and particularly stabilization that happen inside these practices that aren't just about managing stress. It's almost like, to my mind, like, allowing, nurturing, creating a space for a kind of steadiness to emerge at a very intimate part of your own experience, almost behind your normal self, your everyday self. It's almost what looks through your eyes that starts to wake up a little bit. And that, it has a lot of play. There's a lot of places that can go that are beyond just managing stress. And one of my concerns is that as the pragmatism is emphasized, as the superficiality of how it looks or whatever is circulated, that the potential for those kinds of transformations that are subtler, they maybe take longer time, they require more humility, at least parts of the time, that it's kind of crowding out the room for that kind of thing to grow.
There's essentially we're doing yoga for a number of reasons, stabilization of the mind, but that involves a deep amount of relaxation and acceptance of how things actually are, as opposed to what we're supposed to be doing or what we have to do, or what we think is the ideal thing. And it takes a lot. Sometimes we have to peel those out of our gripping hands, those ideas. And so it's important to find some way of walking away from the constant notifications on our phones and computers, and actually be with something in a simple way. I mean, I think, and we haven't really talked about too much about the psychedelic sanghas, and there's a correlation between the way Patanjali looks at perception and the way that the 50s and 60s psychedelic pioneers looked at what is mind manifesting. And there's a lot of correlations that are very interesting. But at its root is a sense of relaxation to the perceiver, to us seeing, which correlates a bit to me on a yoga mat, to me versus on the outside world, but also whatever arises during a micro dose or a major psychedelic experience. And how that is integrated into the rest of our lives rather than just a rupture or a schizo is actually takes work.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work, and we just have a minute or two left here, and the one that the element that comes through to me from what you've been talking about is just the ability to accept things as they are, not meaning accept that, well, this is just the way things are, but to be very honest about what is actually happening, even if that's terrifying, even if it's anxiety producing. And that honesty itself becomes a kind of cooling, even in a kind of ambrosia that lets you be with something, not run away from it. And that honesty itself seems to take you into those deeper zones of stabilization.
Yeah, there's a subjective quality to that, as things are, when I was discussing, which has to do with just accepting that sense of acceptance and awareness in concert, regardless of the qualities of those things.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there. I want to say that Spiro and I will be doing psychedelic sanghas together sometimes in Los Angeles, and you can find out more on my website, techgnosis.com, and his own zone, Los Angeles Yoga Club.org. So check out there, or through the connections from there. You'll find it one way or the other. Anything else there, Spiro?
No, just keep open. And, keep the mind subtle, keep the mind supple.
Or as we like to say here, keep your minds open. Until next week.